Hello and welcome to the cockpit of a Convair B-58 Hustler, which was a Mach 2 capable Cold War bomber with the United States. And in this video I'm going to take you on a guided tour. First I'm going to walk around the outside and show you what makes it unique and interesting, and then we're going to climb back up here into the cockpit and I'll show you a bit more around here. So let's get into the tour. I'm Paul Stewart and I make videos about planes. This includes flight reviews on board inaugural and retirement flights, and also guided tours through interesting aircraft in museums where I bang my head a lot. If you're into these types of videos, then please check out my channel and subscribe. And a massive thanks to the Strategic Air Command and Aerospace Museum in Nebraska for letting me film this aircraft. It was no easy feat getting up into this plane and many others, and I'm very grateful. And also the B58.com website was invaluable as I researched this plane. Let's first begin with some history. The story begins in 1947 with General Curtis LeMay, the Deputy Chief of Air Staff for Research and Development, putting out a request for a jet-powered medium bomber due to enter service in the late 1950s. Now I'll just stop you there for one moment because I did say the 1940s. Now World War II had just finished and we were flying around in B-29s, yet plans for something incredible like this were already being drawn up. Boeing originally won the contract with the turboprop-powered XB-55, but the Air Force became increasingly aware of the potential benefits of delta wings, and the high production numbers of the B-47 meant that there was no need for another subsonic bomber, so the XB-55 program was cancelled. Convair were formally given the contract for the Generalized Bomber Study 2, called GMO-2, as they had experience with the ill-fated delta wing XF-92, which I filmed and got an upcoming video on that. They also were in the process of learning about the delta wing and supersonic flight with the F-102 and F-106 programs. The first design proposals were quite wild. They initially considered a parasite concept where the aircraft would be flown partway under a B-36. It would have 2 crew members, 4 turbojet engines and an expendable pod, similar in principle to what we saw with the B-58 eventually, although the pod would include the bomb plus radar scanner, 3 expendable engines, and fuel, all of which would be dropped. It would speed up to Mach 1.6 and cruise at 52,000 feet. This was followed by a proposal for a 5-engine parasite that would start the journey under a B-36. 3 of those engines would be expendable, with 1 in a center pod and 2 in underwing pods. It would drop the center pod with the bomb and 1 engine at Mach 1.5, then drop the 2 other engine pods and complete the trip home with just 2 engines. In January 1951, Convair proposed the MX-1626, which was a long-range supersonic reconnaissance bomber. This was a larger design and closer to what the B-58 became, but with single engines within each wing and an expendable one in the ventral pod. In December of the same year, 1951, the parasite idea was finally cancelled, as was the idea of an expendable engine. On February 1, 1952, the USAF announced the General Operational Requirement Supersonic Aircraft Bomber 51. It called for a long-range reconnaissance bomber with a combat radius of 5,000 miles, supersonic flight, fly up to 50,000 feet and use in-air refueling. They wanted it to be fairly small as they expected that would reduce its radar cross-section. Boeing and Convair moved ahead with proposals, although we will only focus on Convair's in this video. Convair proposed the MX-1964, moving the engines into underwing pods and having 4 in total, and the USAF tentatively designated it the B-58 and gave the contract to Convair on November 18, 1952. Initially there were concerns about heating, so the inboard engines were positioned in separate underwing pylons, while the outboard engines were positioned above the wing. The ventral pod also needed to be changed, as you can see this differs significantly from the production B-58 in this older mock-up. In this, both the pod had a nose gear for takeoff, and then the return part of the aircraft had another nose gear because the original would have been expended. So the pod was completely redesigned to something smaller and closer to what we see here on this final design mock-up. Wingtip fuel tanks were added to compensate for the smaller pod, and a Coke bottle shape was added to the fuselage after engineers discovered the transonic area rule problems. After discovering that placing the engines together on a single pod caused higher amounts of drags than expected, they split them, resolving the problem. Then in August 1954, the final design was decided with the wing tip tanks removed and all of the fuel being stored internally and in the ventral pod. On the 11th of November 1956, the first B-58 Hustler completed its maiden flight. Obviously, being a short test flight, they didn't require either the bomb or the fuel from the ventral pod, so this one looks especially sleek and somewhat naked without it. Starting at the front of this aircraft, and what's striking is how small the fuselage is. If you've seen my B-36 and B-47 videos, then you'll know how imposing both of those aircraft are. Yet this is extremely thin, albeit quite a long distance off the ground. This almost looks more like a large fighter than a long-distance bomber. Because a high cruising speed was an early goal, the thinking was that a smaller frontal cross-section was going to be an important factor, and while the fuselage was perfectly sized for high speed, it didn't allow much room for a weapons bay, so they had this unique and combined removable bomb and fuel pod underneath the fuselage. But even with this, the limited fuel load remained one of its bigger problems. In fact, General Curtis LeMay joked that the B-58 was fine if you were wanting to bomb Canada. We've walked along underneath the fuselage, and it really didn't take long to get to the rear of the aircraft, and looking forward highlights how thin it is. It's also a very graceful looking aircraft, and I can't but help think it looks a bit like Concorde. While the original plan was just to carry a single nuclear weapon, later thinking changed to carry multiple bombs, so here's 4 hardpoints that were added at a later time for smaller nukes to be positioned. In addition to those unpleasantries, there was also a photo reconnaissance pod, including panoramic cameras and scanning systems instead of the bombs. Apparently during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1963, the B-58 fitted with an AN/APS-73 sideways-looking radar that could map up to 80 nautical miles on each side of the aircraft, overflew hostile territory, providing invaluable data back to headquarters. The pods themselves were an integral part of the B-58's center of gravity. In fact, when they were removed, a counterweight had to be attached to stop the whole aircraft from tipping back onto its tail end. This here was the later TCP, which stands for Twin Component Pod, which was essentially 2 separate pods, with the lower large one being a fuel storage drop tank, and the upper one being the nuclear weapon. Prior to this, they used an MB-1C pod, which was a singular structure that stored the nuclear weapon between 2 fuel tanks, but all of them within the same pod. And while this did look better, they had chronic problems with fuel leaking internally, so they changed to the later setup as you can see here. As you can see, the pod is well over half the length of the entire aircraft, and only stops to allow space for the nose wheel. Instead of folding up like a regular gear, this one has a double kink in it to allow for the retraction without hitting the pod directly behind it. And here's an example of that, although this was a prototype without the ventral pod attached. Otherwise, it's a regular dual wheel gear with steering input from the cockpit. Moving back underneath and looking up at the 3 crew positions, and it's a novel idea giving them 3 separate canopies, although it makes sense especially when you see that the latter 2 crew are quite a long distance away from the pilot. This was because of the navigation systems being positioned between them. Moving further back, and we have the insertion points for fuel, electricity, and the pneumatic air cart used to start the engines under most circumstances. Now this would include full alert starts, but later on explosive cartridges were added that could be used to start engine number 2, which then itself would start the other 3 engines, and I'll mention more about that once we're inside the cockpit. Now the wing is what's known as a delta wing, with the leading edge having a 60-degree sweep. While they were well suited to high altitude supersonic flights, and lots of storage room for fuel, they were less effective at low altitudes and low speeds. Therefore it had to take off and land at higher speeds and at a higher angle of attack, which means that the nose had to be a long way up in the air before it generates enough lift to get the whole plane off the ground. They used a novel materials design by covering the wings with sandwich panels made of aluminium sheets with fiberglass and aluminium honeycomb between them. This was designed to help it tolerate the extreme aerodynamic heating. In areas where the heat would be even more extreme, such as the engine exhaust, a stainless steel honeycomb was used. While this was relatively light and strong, it was very complex and expensive to manufacture. The whole wing was an integral fuel tank, and fuel could flow between the bulkheads, and apparently this could lead to some fuel stacking which did affect its stability, but a valve did stop movement of the fuel from one wing to the other when one was higher during banking. The fiberglass honeycomb I mentioned just before also helped insulate the fuel from the aerodynamic heating as well. The rest of the fuel was stored within the fuselage and that pod. Let's check out the landing gear, which had to be especially long due to the pylon-mounted engines and the large pod underneath. The main strut is very thick, or beefy to use a technical term, and this is because the B-58 had a high takeoff and landing speed that I mentioned earlier, therefore they would be exposed to high stresses. Each gear had 8 separate tyres, which were unusually small, and this allowed for them to take up less space within the wing after retraction, allowing the wing to remain thin and leave more room for fuel. And to avoid the rubber wheels melting from the aerodynamic heating and Mach 2, the landing gear wheel wells were pressurised and air-conditioned. These were fitted with nitrogen, which is less volatile, and pumped up to 280 psi. My car's tyres are around 35 psi, and the high pressure was needed to help manage the intense takeoff and landing speeds. Now here is one of the 4 General Electric J79 afterburning turbojets producing up to 15,000 pounds of thrust each. These 4 engines propelled it to a top speed of 1,319 miles an hour, and it had a service ceiling of around 63,400 feet. The engines were so powerful that it could climb over 40,000 feet in just a single minute, which is pretty incredible. This engine was also used in the F-104 Starfighter, the A-5 Vigilante, and even the SSMN-9 Regulus II cruise missile, which carried a nuclear warhead. It's interesting to see the radiation warnings up here, and that's for the exciter box, which feeds the igniter plugs that then goes on to ignite the fuel-air mixture. The exciter box itself contains a radioactive isotope of hydrogen called tritium, and that releases beta radiation, so it's not a risk to humans unless you somehow ingest it. It's what's also used in the radioluminescent watches that you can see in the dark. Now let's walk back over to our aircraft and look at engine number 1. It did have this intake cover locked into position, so through the magic of editing trickery, we'll jump to Dayton, where you can see their conical spike that could move to optimize airflow. At supersonic speeds, a shockwave forms at the inlet, which starves the air entering the engine. This was most pronounced at Mach 1.4, so once this speed was reached, the cone would automatically move forward, pushing the shockwave further forward, allowing air to enter, but also slow it to subsonic speed so that it didn't damage the engine. That vent underneath there could take in cold air, bypassing the hot core, and be used to cool the hydraulic systems and the nacelle, and be released back into the jet exhaust at the end. This here is a General Electric YJ93 turbojet engine from the XB70 Valkyrie, and planned to go into the XF108 Interceptor as well. The B-58 was actually used as a flying testbed because the engine was ready before either of the other aircraft, so they instead installed one in a modified ventral pod as the NB-58A. Multiple flights were successfully completed, including Mach 2, but ultimately the F-108 was cancelled and the XB-70 program was redirected from strategic bombing to high altitude and speed research, and only 2 were ever made. Moving past engine number 2 and walking along the fuselage again past the beefy landing gear, and we'll have a look at the tail end. Here is the defensive equipment, which includes chaff dispensers, and a single 6-barrel 20mm rotary cannon with a firing rate of 4,000 rounds per minute, although only 1,600 rounds were carried on board. Above that in the fairing was an Emerson MD7 targeting radar for that cannon, which was remotely controlled by the defensive systems operator in the third seat, so the fire control system would lock onto and track the target, but the DSO would need to physically press the fire button. Because this was meant to fly faster than any known fighter jets, they only ever expected to be firing backwards, hence why there's just this single gun at the rear. Due to the high landing speeds, there was also a drogue parachute that would be released from under here. As you can see, there were no horizontal stabilizers, which was not uncommon with the delta wing design, so roll and pitch were controlled by these large drooping elevons. Replacing the elevators, which would usually be on the horizontal stabilizer, the elevons moved in the same direction, together lifting or lowering the nose, and replacing the ailerons, which would usually roll the aircraft. These 2 elevons work in opposite directions. You can see the rudder also moving here in support as well. The power control link assembly influences these hydraulically actuated control surface movements depending on the aircraft speed, because obviously at higher speeds, air will be moving past much faster, so any control surface movement would have more of an effect. To avoid the pilot inadvertently putting too much pressure on the airframe with the movement of the control surface, the system will reduce the intensity of any movement at a higher speed. Moving our way forward and underneath the delta wing, and yes, I'm getting a lot of steps up with this video, we'll look at the back of the engine nacelles. The engine itself has been removed from this one, so what you're looking at is the back of the inlet cone. By the way, if you do enjoy these videos, then please consider becoming a channel member. There's no perks, but it does help me make more of these videos, which take a long time to edit. If you can't afford it, then that's fine, but please comment and give the video a thumbs up, as those are totally free and support the channel. On the nose here was a refueling receptacle with a cover that was flush with the fuselage. A major problem with the B-58 was the small range, thus requiring constant refueling, and it was one of the reasons why the B-52 was just a better aircraft for this role. Now for the most exciting part, getting inside and on top of this incredible piece of engineering. Stairs were organised, and now I'm around 3 meters or 10 feet up in the air. As you would expect, it was not an easy process getting into the pilot's seat, although I can only imagine that it would have been much more difficult for the crew with all of their equipment. Having said that, because of the escape capsule that I'll mention shortly, and you can see here, they were able to wear far thinner and less durable clothes than other pilots of the era, because they were never going to be ejected out into the elements, as they would always be inside the cockpit, or at worst, inside the ejection pod. As you would expect from this era, there are no glass screens and everything is analog. That's both due to the age, but also the extreme heat of the fuselage that would have been a problem for the screens, similar to what I'll mention more in an upcoming SR71 video. First, let's check out the left or port side control panel. You've got the autopilot on the top, engine starters, and the cartridge starter for engine number 2. Here's a photo of that being used, and the crew were recommended to have the canopy down before starting, as to avoid being covered in smoke. This allowed for a rapid start without the need for ground equipment. Moving forward, and as you can probably tell, you have the 4 engine throttles here. The afterburners would activate automatically once the throttles were moved far enough forward. There are the light controls, the landing gear lever, and lights to confirm that the gear is down. Importantly, this button is the weapons release and shared with the bombardier behind him, as you would always require 2 crew members to agree to release the nuclear weapons. The bombing computer would usually automatically release the weapon, but if there was a failure, it can be released via this button. Moving into the center, and there are the usual flight control dials, including the Mach meter, which looks like it goes up to around Mach 2.2. On the right are 4 columns, below the fire extinguisher controls showing the engine parameters for the 4 engines. In the center is a control stick with the usual buttons, and this is not shared with any other crew members. Unlike some other aircraft like the B-47, you'll see my tour through that, and that's simply because the guy behind could barely see anything forward anyway. There was an artificial fuel system to stop the pilot from accidentally overstressing the airframe, as I said before. Here on the right hand side are the fuel controls, and of interest, these could not take off with a full load of fuel because they would simply be too heavy and need a too long runway. So they'd take off partially full and then immediately meet up with a tanker to top up and continue the journey. Continuing around, and you have the controls for the air conditioning and pressurization system. Of interest, down here the pilot can select between normal cabin pressurization, combat, or dump. The idea of combat is that it was only partially pressurized, reducing the effect of a potential explosive decompression. And dump was obviously with no pressurization at all. And there's electrical, hydraulic, and other systems down there as well. There is a bomb arming control here with a cover over it to ensure that it wasn't moved accidentally, and again, this was to confirm that both the pilot and the nav bomber agreed to drop together. And above that was the lamp panel to warn of particular problems. A novel idea introduced was the use of a recorded female voice referred to as Sexy Sally that research demonstrated could gain the pilot's attention to an important problem, but also to keep them calm. As so happens, female voices were better suited to that role. This cable pulley system here was the communication system where the 3 pilots could write each other messages if the crew intercom system went down. Moving back towards the center again, and you have the levers that would force my legs into the escape capsule prior to an ejection. Let's discuss these encapsulated escape pods that were introduced and then retrofitted to older B-58s after it became evident that regular ejection seats wouldn't survive leaving the aircraft at Mach 2.
So behind me is the safety capsule. So you can sort of see this structure here. This is a bit that would fold down. Now if I can just spin the camera around.
The telescoping doors would close in a quarter second, coming down where my hand is, forming an airtight and pressurized cocoon for the crew member. These red levers would forcefully pull my legs up into my chest and stop them from being surgically removed by the doors and flailing about inside the capsule, potentially causing more harm to them. The control stick remains within the safety capsule so the pilot could maintain control of the aircraft, and there is a window in the capsule doors so that the pilot can see the instruments. Originally, the capsule could not be reopened in flight, but later on, if the pilot does decide that the threat has gone, he can pull it open and continue flying as usual. But if the threat remains, then they're all safely cocooned in there and ready to be ejected by pulling the lever. In addition to helping the crew survive the supersonic wind blast and maintain pressure at high altitude, the capsule's parachute would slow its descent to the ground, and there was also an impacting absorbent system underneath, and a flotation device designed to last several days at sea. It was successfully used, although some pilots disliked it, as their thinking was that any aircraft breakup at Mach 2 would result in sudden death anyway, so it was just more unnecessary complexity. Of interest, these capsules were tested using live bears inside them. On the 21st of March 1962, a bear named Yogi, who was roughly the same weight as a human, was sedated and ejected at 35,000 feet at 870 miles an hour, and another bear had the same experience 2 weeks later. While both survived without any problems, the sedation required to make the whole experiment somewhat humane also interfered with their biometric parameters, calling into question the whole process, so bears weren't used widely. Okay, so now it's time to check out the seat behind. Remember my comment earlier about the delta wing providing poor low speed lift, so they would have to take off and land at a high angle of attack. The problem with this is that the nose would then be pointing upwards and obscuring the forward view, so making landing more challenging. That's why other delta wing aircraft like the Concorde and Tu-144 had noses that would mechanically droop, giving the pilot better vision. Spinning around, and there was a pretty epic view of the wing and engines. Here also is the pilot's escape capsule from above, showing you how much or how little room there is around it. As I stumbled back out and used my hands to bend my legs in directions I didn't know that I could, check out the reinforced windows that were strong enough to survive the aerodynamic heating from high-speed flight and a potential bird strike from low-altitude flying. There was more of a gap between the first and second crew members because the navigation systems were stored in there. They had to be within the climate-controlled and pressurized part of the fuselage to protect them from the extreme temperatures of the rest of the fuselage. We'll move the ladder, and next I'll sit down in the Bombardier Navigator's station. An obvious difference from the pilot seat is the lack of windows, and what you can't really see in the video is how the forward panel is angled downwards and towards your face. It was pretty tight fitting my large head down between the dash and the top of the ejection capsule. I suspect though this was because it was designed to be easily in reach for the crew member before they introduced the larger escape capsules, but now with those capsules your face is actually pretty close to it. Navigation was primarily done with a Doppler inertial system using the Astro Tracker device on top, and I'll show you that shortly as a primary heading reference. A dead reckoning system would cross-reference with that en route, and the search radar could be used to confirm those systems, and corrections made if necessary. But obviously radar would need to be used at least, as the radar waves themselves could be identified by the adversary. On the left, you have a whole lot of circuit breakers, and the structure above that is a window with one on the opposite side too. Here's a view of that from the outside. Back inside is an air vent, which is quite literally the only creature comfort you get. In the center here you have the search radar. In the aircraft's nose, there was a radar, and its role was essentially to correct errors in the other navigation systems and or act as a backup if the other systems failed. Here on the upper left is the indicator panel for information about the speed, track, altitude, distance to the predetermined target, etc. In the center and on top is the offset and storage panel. Here on the right is the malfunction panel to quickly let the crew member know what was failing, and below that was more navigation equipment. Looking down at my feet again, at the ejection pod and the aggressive stirrups and on the floor is where the shell would drop to, so I'd need to be within that line. On the right again is the tracking and flight control unit for positioning the radar crosshairs for bombing approaches and radar approaches during landing. And behind that was a small tunnel forward to the equipment bay that would be used by ground maintenance crew rather than the in-flight crew. The cable there is the pulley mechanism for the crew writing messages to each other that can come from in front and or continue to the third crew member, and presumably they had to be careful not to include gossip about the middle guy.
There was space down here to move between the two back seat positions, but again, not enough space to crawl forward into the pilot seat. And back in the middle is the bombing control panel. You can see the 4 columns, 1 for the ventral pod, and then 4 for the smaller attachments. There were more controls in the middle, such as the burst altitude. Next, let's climb up out of the seat and into the third and final crew member's seat, the Defensive System Operator, or DSO. And yes, I have been told before that I seem to stick out my tongue when I'm concentrating. No idea why or if it helps, but at least I didn't fall off the plane. And by the way, the name Hustler comes from a statement made by a senior Convair engineer who was talking about its speed, and said, "Sounds like it'll really be a hustler." The nickname stuck and was eventually made official by the Air Force. This is slightly easier because you can stabilize yourself on the wing before getting into the seat, and you can see how small the window is near my right leg. While I'm up here, I'll swing the camera towards the tail where you get a bit of a view of the narrow waist, although we'll walk over there properly later in the video, and then turn around and look forward again just to take in the view. I'm fairly sure at this point in time I'm the luckiest AV geek alive being allowed to walk all over a B-58 Hustler, and I'm very grateful and excited, as I keep saying. Looking down into the seat again, and it's a narrow gap between the dash and the escape capsule, and again you get to watch what I used to think was a reasonably flexible guy squeeze down into the seat. Check out my B-47 and B-36 inside tour videos for more similar groaning and moaning from me. Imagine having to do this with all of your equipment, and also the fear of knowing that you're possibly under nuclear attack. Now there is more missing from this seat, so we'll have to use some imagination. As is often the case, parts are taken from retired planes to keep the rest of the fleet airworthy, and obviously classified equipment is also removed before being given to museums. Here on the left console was the remote control cannon, with the red firing button. As I said before, the target was identified and tracked by the radar above it, but then it was up to the crew member to initiate the kill. In the center here are the flight instruments to keep you updated on speed, altitude, fuel, etc. And I suppose it's interesting seeing the empty sections as it shows how everything is just in modules and they simply slide and plug in. This here on the left was the radar warning receiver, which detects adversary radar waves and roughly what direction that they're coming from, informing you that the enemy may be able to identify your position. Advanced systems can identify the signal, modify it, and then return incorrect signals back to their source in an effort to confuse it. Now let's get out and go for a walk on the top. First up, we'll look at the KS-39 Star Tracker, which would track multiple celestial bodies, providing the aircraft's location, so essentially an automated version of what sailors have been using for hundreds of years. The bomb navigation system would combine information from this, the inertial navigation system, and the Doppler radar below the tail to provide guidance for both the weapons and the plane. Walking further back, and we arrive at the fin, so it's really quite a short walk, highlighting again how relatively small the aircraft was. Looking down at the wing, and you can make out the size of this massive elevon and a quick glimpse of the USAF Randall. It's interesting to note that the Randall is only on the single wing, and the other side simply has the USAF text. This has been the case for years, as they would originally have this on both wings, but discovered that it would help enemy pilots aim for the fuselage, as they would simply have to aim for the middle of the two distinct logos. With just the one, they would no longer have the same reference points. Having said that, it is less of an issue now, as most shooting happens outside of visual range, but it's interesting nonetheless. You'll have noticed a mention of Tokyo at the front of this aircraft. That's because in 1963, this very B-58 flew from Tokyo to London with one stop in Alaska and 5 aerial refuelings in just 8 hours, 35 minutes and 2 seconds, averaging 938 miles an hour. Most of the flight was at Mach 2, but an afterburner malfunctioned for the last 60 minutes of the flight reduced the average speed considerably. This record still stands, and the aircraft was operational with no modifications. The aircraft was named Greased Lightning, which was the codename for the project to break the record. The B-58 had an important role during the development of the YF-12 Interceptor's weapons system. The AIM-47A air-to-air missile and the AN/ASG-18 fire control system were ready for in-flight tests before the rest of the YF-12 was, so the USAF asked Convair to modify a B-58 to begin the in-flight testing, leading to this handsome-looking fellow with an almost 7-foot nose job. It had a modified pod to carry the missile, and the fuel tanks were removed. Development of the YF-12 progressed, and this was no longer needed, and the aircraft was scrapped to Edwards Air Force Base. I mentioned before the trainer version, the B-58A, which was converted from early B-58 prototypes. Here the student sat in the forward cockpit, the pilot in the second station where the flight controls were all duplicated and the seat was slightly offset to give them a bit of a view of the front, and the third seat was usually occupied by another student watching along. The back seats also had more windows, and much of the weapons and navigation equipment was removed. Early on in the B-58's existence, high-altitude ground-to-air missiles such as the Soviet SA-2 resulted in a change of doctrine from high-altitude and speed flying to low-altitude penetration flights that would now fly under the radar. Unfortunately, the B-58 wasn't designed for this, and the lower altitudes resulted in much lower speeds. The B-52 was also flying at lower speeds and altitude, but was much cheaper to operate and could carry more weapons, so the Department of Defense publicly announced the B-58's retirement from service by the end of January 1970. There were both larger and more powerful B-58B and C models planned, although neither went into production, as favour with the military was turning against Convair's jet. General Curtis LeMay was quite a powerful enemy to have. It's worth mentioning the Model 58-9, which was a supersonic transporter first proposed by Convair in 1961. Using an enlarged version of the B-58's fuselage and wing, it could carry around 50 passengers at up to Mach 2, although the program was cancelled in the early stages. Out of the 116 B-58s assembled, 24 were lost in crashes, which is quite a high loss rate. The urgency of the design process in the midst of the Cold War resulted in programs being rushed, and at the time, crashes and test pilot deaths were accepted as a part of the process. Thankfully, this has changed now, although, as you see with modern aircraft, the design process for anything now takes decades, and this is one of the reasons why. Please check out my channel for many other similar guided tour videos, and subscribe because there's many more coming. Thanks for watching.